The creatures that could not be tamed. In the far reaches of the Milky Way, where the light of dying stars barely flickered, whispered tales of the Groks haunted every shadowed spaceport, every dimly lit cantina. They weren't just creatures, they were myths made flesh, a nightmare that clawed its way into reality. No one had seen a Grok and lived to describe it in full detail. What survived were fragments of terror, blazing eyes that radiated raw power, scales that shimmered like liquid metal, and a roar that could crack the hull of a star cruiser. The elder races of the galaxy, the Valorians, the Kilthar, the Zern, had all learned one painful truth: the Groks were untouchable. These creatures weren't just beasts, they were untamable forces of nature. Entire fleets sent to hunt them had vanished, and planets surrendered in fear when the shadow of a Grok passed too close. For centuries, the galaxy had one rule when it came to the Groks: stay away. But then humans arrived. The galaxy had scoffed when humanity first stumbled onto the galactic stage. A fledgling species with fragile bodies, short lives, and a peculiar tendency to poke at things that should have been left alone. To the elder races, humans were a reckless experiment, destined to extinguish themselves before they could leave a mark. Yet, humanity did what they always did. They survived. They thrived. They clawed their way into the galactic fold with patched-up ships and boundless curiosity, bringing with them an audacity that bordered on insanity. They didn't just explore. They dared to dream of the impossible. And no dream was more impossible than taming the Groks. "Are you completely mad, Dr. Cal?" The voice crackled over the comm system, barely masking the incredulity behind it. Dr. Kara Kale, a human biologist renowned for her groundbreaking work on interstellar ecosystems, smirked as she adjusted the controls of her cramped shuttle. The holographic map of her destination, a desolate moon orbiting the dying star Iros, flickered before her. "Madness is just another word for ambition," she replied, her tone laced with defiance. The voice on the other end groaned. "Iris 4 is a death trap. You've read the reports. The Groks aren't just predators. They're apex hunters. They've destroyed fleets, Dr. Kale. Fleets. What do you think you're going to accomplish with a handful of pheromone emitters and a team of grad students?" Kale leaned back in her seat, her fingers tracing the edges of a holo image of a Grok, a blurry, scaled monstrosity with blazing crimson eyes. "You're thinking like them," she said, her voice softening. "The elder races only saw the Groks as enemies to be defeated. But what if we've been looking at them the wrong way? What if their behavior isn't just primal instinct, but something more? Something we can communicate with?" The line went silent for a moment before the voice replied, softer this time. "You're staking everything on a theory, Kale. If you're wrong—" "I know," she interrupted, her gaze hardening. "But if I'm right, we're not just studying them. We're changing everything." The battered freighter carrying Kale and her team shuddered as it entered the thin atmosphere of Iros 4. The moon was a barren wasteland, its surface marred by craters and jagged rock formations that glowed faintly under the light of the red dwarf star it orbited. The atmosphere was thin, barely breathable, and carried an eerie stillness that set every nerve on edge. Kale glanced at her team. 5 grad students, each looking increasingly pale as the freighter descended. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even seasoned explorers. They were idealists, dreamers, and a few unlucky souls who owed Cal enough favors to follow her into what most considered a suicide mission. "Final equipment check," she barked, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "Pheromone emitters calibrated." "Calibrated," came a nervous reply from Jenna, the team's behavioral specialist. "Neurodampeners sensed." "Sensed," said Rady, their tech expert, though his hands were visibly shaking as he adjusted his datapad. Kale nodded. "Good. Remember, this isn't about brute force. The Groks have survived everything the galaxy's thrown at them because everyone treated them like monsters. We're here to prove there's something more." The freighter landed with a jarring thud, sending a plume of ash-like dust into the air. Kale stood, adjusting the harness of her field pack. "Welcome to Grok territory, kids. Stick to the plan, and we might just live to rewrite the history books." Stepping onto the surface of Iosphere felt like entering a graveyard. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of boots on brittle ground. The air was bitterly cold, and the faint hum of their life support systems served as a constant reminder of how hostile this environment truly was. Kel's heart raced as she scanned the horizon. Somewhere out there, hidden among the craters and jagged rocks, were the creatures she had spent her entire career obsessing over. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave this desolate moon to its monstrous inhabitants. But she pushed forward. "Movement. 3 o'clock, Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. Kale turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. At first, she saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement, a glimmer of iridescent scales catching the faint light of the red dwarf. It was smaller than she had expected, sleek and agile, with eyes that glowed like embers. A juvenile grok. "Hold your positions," Kale hissed, raising a hand. Her fingers hovered over the controls of the pheromone emitter strapped to her wrist. "Let it come to us." The juvenile grok tilted its head, sniffing the air. Its gaze locked onto the group, and a low growl rumbled from its throat, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The air grew thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity. Kale activated the emitter, releasing a carefully calibrated burst of synthetic pheromones designed to mimic submission. The grok froze, its nostrils flaring. Time seemed to stand still as the creature's glowing eyes flickered, its growl subsiding into a wary silence. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the grok bounded away, disappearing into the jagged terrain. Kale exhaled, her heart pounding. That wasn't aggression, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. That was curiosity. Her team exchanged uneasy glances, but Kale's eyes burned with determination. This was only the beginning. For 3 days, they tracked the groks, moving cautiously across the lunar wasteland. The juveniles appeared sporadically, watching from a distance, but never engaging. Kale's theory held. For now, the emitters worked, projecting non-threatening signals that seemed to hold the creature's aggression at bay. But on the 4th day, everything changed. They encountered their first adult grok. It was massive, its scales shimmering like polished amethysts under the faint starlight. Its eyes burned with a violent crimson, and every step it took sent tremors through the ground. This was no juvenile testing its boundaries. This was an apex predator, a creature that had no equal. Kale froze, her hand hovering over the emitter's controls. The grok's gaze locked onto her, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then it roared, a sound so primal and deafening that it shook the very air. Kale felt the weight of it in her chest, her instincts screaming at her to run. But she didn't. Instead, she activated the emitter, sending out a signal not of submission, but of respect, a calculated gamble that could either save them or doom them all. The dance of predators and prey. The grok's roar echoed across the desolate terrain of Iosphere, a chilling reminder of why no one dared to cross into their territory. Its eyes burned like molten fire, unyielding and intense, as it locked onto Kale. The sheer size of the beast made the air feel heavier, its presence overwhelming, as though gravity itself bent under the weight of its existence. Every instinct in Kale's body screamed for her to run, to flee, to abandon everything she had worked for and save herself. But she didn't move. Her team crouched low behind the jagged rocks, their breaths held in terrified unison. Ravi clutched his datapad like a lifeline, his fingers trembling as he prepared to recalibrate the emitters. Jenna's face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. None of them had imagined the creature would get this close. None of them were ready. Kale, however, wasn't here to be ready. She was here to push the limits of understanding, to look into the abyss and see what lay beyond the fear. Slowly, deliberately, She raised her wrist, the pheromone emitter strapped to it humming faintly as it released another carefully calculated burst into the frigid air. The grok paused. Its massive head tilted, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the faint scent carried by the wind. Its growl softened into a low rumble, a sound that vibrated through the ground and into Cal's chest. She couldn't tell if it was curiosity or the prelude to an attack. Her heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Hold your positions," she whispered into her comm. "Do not engage." Her team didn't respond, but the silence told her they were listening. For now, that was enough. A game of patience. The grok circled Cal, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step it took was impossibly precise, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Its scales shimmered with an iridescent glow, a hypnotic blend of violet and green that seemed almost liquid in motion. It sniffed the air again, its massive body looming closer. Cal's mind raced. She had studied every scrap of data on these creatures, poring over stolen behavioral records and decrypted telemetry logs. The groks were more than mindless predators. They were intelligent, social creatures with a rigid hierarchy. Their packs operated with precision, each individual playing a specific role within their brutal ecosystem. This wasn't an ambush, it was an evaluation. Alpha behavior, Cal muttered to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of the creature's heavy breaths. "It's testing me." The pheromone emitter was her only tool, its settings painstakingly calibrated to mimic a blend of submission and respect, an acknowledgement of the grok's dominance without projecting weakness. It was a razor-thin line, one that could snap at any moment. Cal adjusted the settings, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The device released another pulse, the faint mist carrying the synthetic pheromones into the air. The grok stopped, its fiery eyes narrowing. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then it roared again, the sound deafening and primal. Cal flinched but didn't move. The creature's massive frame shifted, its muscles rippling under its shimmering hide. Slowly, it turned away, retreating back into the jagged rocks without another glance. Cal exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That, she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline, wasn't aggression. That was acknowledgement. The theory takes shape. Back at their makeshift camp, the tension was palpable. Ravi paced nervously, muttering to himself as he checked the equipment. Jenna sat cross-legged on the ground, her hands shaking as she reviewed the data from her handheld scanner. The rest of the team huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. Cal stood at the center, her gaze fixed on the holographic projection of the grok. The image flickered as the projector struggled to stabilize, but the outline of the creature remained clear, a towering behemoth with an aura of raw power. "We're onto something," Cal said, breaking the silence. The grok didn't attack. It observed. It responded. Jenna looked up, her brow furrowed. "Responded how?" "By roaring in your face. That thing could have crushed you without a second thought." Cal shook her head. "No, it didn't see me as a threat. It was testing me, deciding whether or not I was worth its time. That roar wasn't aggression. It was communication." Ravi stopped pacing. "You're saying it recognized the pheromones?" "That it understood them." "Not in the way we understand language," Cal replied. "But it reacted. It acknowledged. That's more than anyone's ever gotten from a grok." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For centuries, the elder races had written off the groks as mindless killers, creatures of pure instinct and destruction. But if Cal was right, if they could communicate, then everything the galaxy thought it knew about these creatures was wrong. And that changed everything. The stakes are raised. Over the next 3 days, Cal's team tracked the groks with renewed focus. The pheromone emitters allowed them to move closer than anyone had dared before, observing the creature's behavior from a distance. The juveniles remained cautious, darting in and out of view like shadows. But the adults were different, calculated, deliberate, and impossibly intelligent. Kel's theory began to take shape. The Groks weren't mindless predators. They were a highly evolved species with a complex social structure, their behavior driven by a blend of primal instinct and strategic intelligence. Their roars, growls, and subtle body movements weren't random. They were a form of communication, a language waiting to be decoded. But understanding them wasn't enough. Kale needed proof. She needed a breakthrough. That breakthrough came on the fourth night. Jenna had been monitoring a juvenile grok from the safety of the camp, her scanner tracking its movements as it wandered near the edge of their perimeter. In her excitement, she stepped too far, her signal flickering on Cal's handheld monitor. Before anyone could react, the juvenile snapped its head toward her, its glowing eyes narrowing. It let out a low growl, its body coiling with tension. Jenna froze, her scanner slipping from her hands as the creature began to close the distance. "Don't move," Kale shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. Jenna didn't need to be told twice. She stood perfectly still, her eyes wide with terror as the grok approached. Its growl deepened, vibrating through the ground. Kale's heart raced as she adjusted her emitter, releasing a new sequence of pheromones, a blend of submission and curiosity, a desperate attempt to defuse the situation. The juvenile paused, its nostrils flaring. It tilted its head, the glow of its eyes flickering as it sniffed the air. Then, without warning, it let out a sharp bark and bounded away into the darkness. Jenna collapsed to her knees, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Kale rushed to her side, her own hands trembling as she helped Jenna to her feet. "That wasn't a warning," Kale said, her voice filled with awe. That was hesitation. Her team stared at her, their fear slowly giving way to something else, something they hadn't felt since landing on Iris 4. Hope. The language of beasts. The barren landscape of Iris 4 was as silent as the void itself, a place where every sound echoed like a thunderclap, and every shadow carried the weight of unseen eyes. For 4 days, Kale and her team had walked the razor's edge, tracking the groks while testing the limits of their theories. Each encounter brought them closer to understanding the untamable creatures, yet the risks grew with every step. Kale sat cross-legged in the dim glow of their camp's portable light, her fingers hovering over a holographic projection of pheromone patterns. The data was fascinating, clear evidence that the groks weren't just reacting to fear or hunger, but something deeper. She replayed the sequence from their last encounter. The juvenile's hesitation, the way its body language shifted after Jenna's mistake. It wasn't just survival instinct, it was decision-making. "They're thinking," Kale murmured, her voice breaking the stillness of the camp. "They're making choices." Ravi, who had been tinkering with the emitters nearby, glanced up. "Choices? Like what? Whether to eat us now or save us for later?" Kale ignored the sarcasm, her focus unwavering. "No, they're evaluating us, assessing whether we're a threat, prey, or something else." "Something else?" Jenna asked, her voice still shaky from the encounter days earlier. "What could we possibly be to them?" Kale leaned back, her gaze shifting to the dark horizon where the groks roamed. "That's what we're here to find out." An unlikely pattern. The next morning, the team ventured deeper into grok territory. The terrain grew harsher, the jagged rocks giving way to vast craters that seemed to stretch endlessly under the faint light of the red dwarf star. The air felt heavier here, as though the planet itself was warning them to turn back. "Movement, northeast," Ravi called out, his voice crackling through the comms. Kale raised her hand, signaling the team to stop. Her heart pounded as she scanned the rocky expanse. Then she saw it, an adult grok, larger than any they had encountered before. Its scales shimmered like molten silver, catching the light with an almost hypnotic beauty. It moved with deliberate grace, its eyes glowing a fierce emerald as it prowled across the ridge above them. "It's watching us," Jenna whispered. Kale adjusted the emitter on her wrist, her fingers trembling as she calibrated the pheromones. This time, she didn't release the usual signals of submission or curiosity. Instead, she tried something new, a blend of deference and invitation, a calculated risk to see how the grok would respond. The creature stopped, tilting its massive head as it sniffed the air. Its glowing eyes locked onto Kale, and for a moment, she felt as though it was looking through her rather than at her. The silence stretched, each second an eternity. Then, with a low rumble, the grok turned and disappeared over the ridge. Kale exhaled, her legs trembling beneath her. "It didn't run," she said softly. "It didn't attack either." "Maybe it's waiting for backup," Ravi muttered, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of curiosity in his voice. Kale shook her head. "No, it's something else. They're starting to understand us." The first contact. By the 6th day, the team had established a cautious rhythm. They followed the groks from a distance, documenting their movements and patterns while experimenting with different pheromone sequences. The creatures were no longer avoiding them. Instead, they seemed to be observing, testing the boundaries of their interactions. Kel's breakthrough came when they encountered a grok pack near a large crater. The pack consisted of 3 adults and 2 juveniles, their scales gleaming like precious stones under the dim light. The team watched from a concealed vantage point as the creatures moved with an almost choreographed precision, their roars and growls weaving together like a symphony of unspoken communication. "This is it," Kale said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We need to engage." "Engage?" Jenna's voice cracked with disbelief. "You mean walk right into the middle of that pack and hope they don't rip us apart?" Kale turned to her, her gaze steady. "If we want to understand them, we have to stop observing from a distance. We need to show them that we're not prey, that we're something more." Ravi frowned. "And how exactly do we do that without becoming their next meal?" Kale held up the emitter, her expression resolute. "We communicate." "The bait." Kel volunteered herself as the bait, knowing full well the risks. The team protested, but she silenced them with a single look. "This is my mission," she said firmly. "If we want answers, we can't hide forever." She approached the pack slowly, her steps measured and deliberate. The pheromone emitter pulsed faintly, releasing a carefully calculated blend of signals designed to project respect and curiosity. The groks noticed her immediately, their glowing eyes narrowing as they turned to face her. The largest of the pack, a behemoth with scales that shimmered a deep amethyst, stepped forward, its massive frame blocking the others. Its low growl sent a shiver down Kel's spine, but she didn't falter. She raised her hands slowly, palms facing outward, and stopped a few meters away. "I'm not here to harm you," she said softly, knowing the words themselves didn't matter. It was the tone, the posture, the unspoken language of the moment. The grok tilted its head, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. The pheromones were working, at least for now. It stepped closer, its footsteps shaking the ground. Kel's heart raced, but she held her ground, her gaze steady. The creature let out a deep rumble, its eyes flickering with something that wasn't quite aggression. Curiosity, perhaps. Recognition. Kale slowly reached into her pack and retrieved a small container filled with biosynthetic material, an offering designed to mimic the grok's natural food sources. She placed it on the ground and stepped back, her movements slow and deliberate. The grok sniffed the container, its massive jaws opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. For a moment, Kale thought it might crush the offering in a single bite, but instead, it took the container delicately, its growl softening into a low hum. Kale's calm crackled to life. "Is it? Accepting it?" Jenna's voice was barely a whisper. Kale smiled, relief washing over her. "It's a start." The turning point. As the grok retreated to its pack, the other creatures approached the offering cautiously. They sniffed the biosynthetic material, their growls turning into soft whines and rhythmic chirps. Kel watched in awe as the pack began to share the food, their movements coordinated and almost ritualistic. "This isn't just survival," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "This is culture." Her team stared in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The Groks weren't mindless predators. They were intelligent, social beings with their own rules, their own way of life. Kel's gamble had paid off. The Groks had accepted their presence, not as prey, but as something else entirely. And for the first time, the untamable creatures of legend had begun to see humanity not as enemies, but as equals. The bridge between two worlds. The camp was quiet that night, but the silence wasn't the oppressive, fear-laden stillness they had endured since landing on Irosphere. It was the kind of silence that came after an impossible leap forward, a moment where words felt too small for the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Kel sat by the dim light of the portable heater, staring at the holographic projections flickering in front of her. The data collected from their first successful interaction with the Groks was beyond anything she had hoped for. The creatures hadn't just accepted the offering. They had shared it. They had communicated. The juveniles' hesitant chirps, the adults' low rumbles, and the subtle interplay of body movements. It was a language, raw and unpolished, but undeniably real. "They're not just surviving," Kel murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "They're thriving. They've built a system, an ecosystem, entirely their own." Ravi, still fidgeting with one of the emitters, glanced up. "Yeah, and that system involves turning most things they encounter into dinner." Jenna, seated cross-legged nearby, shook her head. "Not everything. They could have killed Kel today, but they didn't. Because she had an offering," Ravi argued. "What happens when we run out of those synthetic food blocks? Or worse, what happens when they decide we're tastier?" "They won't," Kel said firmly, her gaze never leaving the projection. "We're not just food to them anymore. We're something else. Something valuable." Her words hung in the air, a quiet conviction that carried both hope and a daunting realization. For centuries, the Groks had been seen as apex predators, creatures of destruction and chaos. But Kel had glimpsed something deeper, an intelligence that could reshape the galaxy's understanding of these legendary beings. The question now was simple: could humanity rise to meet the challenge, or would they repeat the mistakes of the elder races? The shift in the balance. By the time dawn crept over the barren horizon, the team was on edge. The Groks had always kept their distance after an encounter, retreating to the shadows as if to remind the humans who truly controlled this desolate moon. But this time, they didn't disappear. Ravi was the first to notice. "We've got movement," he said, his voice taut as he pointed toward the ridge where they'd last seen the pack. Kel followed his gaze, her heart pounding. The Groks were there, silhouetted against the faint light of the red dwarf star. The juveniles moved cautiously, darting back and forth like curious shadows, while the adults stood sentinel, their massive frames radiating a quiet intensity. "They're watching us," Jenna whispered. Kel nodded. "They're waiting." "For what?" Ravi asked, his voice tinged with unease. Kel adjusted the emitter on her wrist. "For us to make the next move. An invitation." Kel stepped forward, her boots crunching against the rocky terrain. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the gravity of a collapsing star. She could feel the eyes of the Groks on her, their glowing gazes tracking her every movement. She stopped a few meters from the ridge, raising her hand slowly to show she meant no harm. The emitter on her wrist pulsed faintly, releasing a calculated blend of pheromones, a mixture of deference and invitation. It was a gamble, like every step of this mission, but Kel trusted her instincts. The largest Grok, a towering behemoth with scales that shimmered like liquid amethyst, stepped forward. Its movements were slow and deliberate, every muscle rippling with power. The ground trembled beneath its weight, a reminder of just how easily it could enter if it chose to. Kel held her ground. The Grok tilted its massive head, sniffing the air. Its low growl vibrated through her chest, not a sound of aggression but something inquisitive. It leaned closer, its fiery eyes narrowing as it studied her. Kel's heart raced, but she kept her posture steady, her breathing controlled. Then, in a moment that felt like the universe itself had paused, the grok lowered its head, letting out a low rumble that sounded almost like a purr. Kale exhaled shakily. "It's acknowledging me," she murmured into her calm. The rest of the pack began to stir. The juveniles darted forward, their movements cautious but curious. One of them sniffed the ground near Kale's boots, letting out a sharp chirp before bounding back to the adults. The others followed, their glowing eyes flickering like distant stars. Kale glanced back at her team. "They're inviting us in. Into the den." The idea of entering a grok pack's territory would have been unthinkable just days ago, a suicide mission guaranteed to end in blood and screams. But now, as Kale and her team followed the creatures into the rocky craters, it felt like stepping into an alien cathedral, a place both sacred and untamed. The groks led them to a massive cavern, its entrance framed by jagged rock formations that glittered faintly under the starlight. Inside, the air was thick with a faint metallic scent, and the walls shimmered with bioluminescent fungi that cast an eerie, otherworldly glow. The pack moved with an unspoken rhythm, their growls and chirps blending into a symphony of communication. Kale watched in awe as the adults guided the juveniles, nudging them gently toward the center of the cavern, where a pile of what appeared to be bones and alien flora lay. It was their den, a place of both survival and something deeper, community. "This is incredible," Kale whispered, her voice trembling with wonder. "They're not just predators. They're a society." The team stayed on the edges of the cavern, their movements careful and deliberate. Ravi recorded every detail with his datapad, his earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet fascination. Jenna, still pale but steady, monitored the grok's body language, noting the subtle shifts in posture and tone. But Kal's focus was on the largest grok, the alpha. It stood apart from the others, its fiery gaze fixed on her with an intensity that felt almost expectant. Kale took a deep breath and stepped forward, her hands raised. The grok growled softly, its massive head tilting as it watched her. Slowly, Kale reached into her pack and retrieved another container of the synthetic food material. She placed it on the ground and stepped back, her movements slow and deliberate. The grok sniffed the offering, its growl deepening. For a moment, Kale thought she had made a mistake, but then the creature lowered its head and nudged the container toward her. "It's giving it back," Jenna said, her voice filled with disbelief. Kale knelt, her heart pounding as she reached for the container. The grok didn't move, its gaze locked onto hers. She opened the container and took out a small piece of the material, holding it out in her palm. The grok sniffed her hand, its massive jaws inches from her fingers. Kal's breath caught as it let out a low rumble, then gently took the food from her hand. The cavern fell silent. Kale looked back at her team, her eyes shining with a mixture of awe and triumph. "We've just bridged the gap," she said softly. "We're not just observers anymore. We're part of their world." A fragile connection. As the night wore on, the groks grew more comfortable with the humans' presence. The juveniles played near the edges of the cavern, their chirps echoing like laughter, while the adults watched with a cautious but undeniable curiosity. Kal's team documented every moment, their fear slowly giving way to a sense of shared discovery. But Kale knew this was only the beginning. The groks had allowed them into their world, but the connection was fragile. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything they had built could be lost. For now, though, Kale allowed herself a rare moment of hope. They had done the impossible, and the galaxy would never be the same.